It's no secret at this point that Borderlands 3 is by far my favorite game in the series. However, just like every other Borderlands game, it got a bunch of stuff wrong in addition to the myriad of things it did right. Hey Vault Hunters, I'm Constant Canadian, and this is the good, the bad, and the ugly of Borderlands 3. Starting off the good with the most obvious difference going from any other Borderlands game to Borderlands 3 is the gameplay. The gameplay in Borderlands 3 is just so much different from its predecessors in a good way. The movement feels super fluid, the guns feel great to shoot, the enemy AI is a lot less stupidly annoying, and many more things that make this game feel so much better to play. That's not to say the other games feel bad to play by any means, but Borderlands 3's gameplay is just leaps and bounds ahead of the previous games in the franchise. This is of course helped significantly by the immense amount of quality of life changes that came out with this game. Changes like buying all ammo with a single button press, fast traveling from anywhere, spawning at any new use station, vehicle presets, switching up our action skills on the fly, autosell, and many more. These quality of life changes make a huge difference in making Borderlands 3 feel just so much better to play, and despite modders trying their best to put these features into Borderlands 2, they never feel quite as smooth or fluid as they do in Borderlands 3. The gameplay of Borderlands 3 is so much better than any other game in the franchise, and it's not even close. Another thing that Borderlands 3 did very well was in its various collectibles. This was a rather unexpected addition to this game, as I've never really looked at Borderlands as a semi-collectathon kind of game, but it actually added an extra layer of things to do, and I personally enjoyed finding all of the various crew challenge collectibles throughout the map. Now I will say that I'm a little upset that in a game with an actual collectible system and a literal cult surrounding the vaults that they didn't bring back the hidden Cult of the Vault symbols hiding around the various maps in the game. But the Claptraps, Typhon Echoes, and Crimson Radio collectibles were a lot of fun to find, and reminded me a lot of the hidden collectibles from the Ezio era of the Assassin's Creed games. I do understand that not everybody likes collectibles in their games, but for those of us who do, it was certainly a nice addition. Borderlands 3 also did very well in its legendary weapons. In most cases, legendaries in Borderlands 1, 2, and the pre-sequel were essentially just a stat increase. Sure, you did have unique weapons that were fundamentally different, like the Pimpernel, Herald, Sandhawk, and the Conference Call, but a lot of legendaries were just a purple gun with 1 to 3 stats turned up to 11, or 1 stat turned up to 15. While I personally like the visual design of the weapons in Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel much more than that of Borderlands 3, the actual functionality of the legendaries and uniques are much better in Borderlands 3. Weapons like the Backburner, the Light Show, the Brainstormer, the Complex Root, the Flipper, the Recursion, and the King and Queen's Calls are all a great example of making a unique weapon actually feel unique. And that's something that Borderlands 3 has a ton of examples of, whereas the other games, examples of this are very few and far between. Build diversity is yet another area where Borderlands 3 absolutely knocked it out of the park. Each and every character has so many different builds they can run and still do reasonably well with. This is helped not only by each character having 4 different action skills and skill trees to work with, but also by just how diverse and well thought out these trees are. While there are a couple of skills in this game that are just a bad choice overall, there are a lot more skills that are a good choice and synergize really well together. The skill trees in Borderlands 3 are really awesome and fun to mess around with. And while I personally think that the pre-sequel skill trees are better, Borderlands 3 skill trees are a very close second. The build diversity in Borderlands 3 is fantastic, and it makes it incredibly difficult to get bored when playing through the game. I've always said that a huge portion of playtime in these games is at the end game, and Borderlands 3 is absolutely no exception to that. While every Borderlands game has a lot of endgame content through raid bosses, farming, and many mobbing arenas, Borderlands 3 takes that and turns it up to 1,000. While Borderlands 3 only has 2 standalone raid bosses that don't require a bunch of mobbing to reach them, it does also have the Maliwan Takedown, the Guardian Takedown, the Slaughter Shaft, the Slaughter Star, the Cistern of Slaughter, all of which are infinitely replayable, and 6 separate proving grounds that are again, infinitely replayable. This leaves you with so many different things to do once you've beaten the game and gives everybody something to do. Even if you don't like raid bossing, you've got a bunch more options. If you don't like how long the Guardian Takedown can take, you've got the Maliwan Takedown. If you just want straight mobbing with non-stop action, you can do the 3 Slaughter maps. Endgame content in Borderlands 3 far outshines anything in the franchise we have to date, at least in my opinion. The main story of Borderlands 3 is a big point of contention among fans, and while I personally don't find the story that bad, I do find it drags on for a little bit too long and doesn't really keep me engaged throughout. But we're not talking about the main story just yet, that's later in the video. What I do want to talk about though is the side quests. The side quests in Borderlands 3 are great. They're fun, well written, funny, entertaining, and sure, some of them are a bit dated, sorry Lord of Skags, there are still a huge amount of great side quests in this game. The biggest problem I feel with the side quests in this game is that they really don't reward all too much. The unique quest rewards for the most part are pretty subpar, and the cash and XP rewards are almost completely negligible. However, for a game that gets so much crap for its bad writing, the side quests in this game are actually pretty exceptional. You get to help Chad perform some sick stunts, you can help Brick find Talon before Mordecai notices they're missing, you can help Tina get revenge on her twisted ex who stole her skag, and you get to uncover lost secrets of a certain guardian angel's past from before the events of even Borderlands 2. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some pretty bad ones like Golden Calves, but a lot of the side quests in Borderlands 3 are super well done, with the biggest problem being that there really isn't any reason to actually do them. There's no super cool quest rewards in the game, there's no real important items locked behind a side quest enemy, and it leads to a lot of players just completely ignoring them, which really sucks because they're a lot of fun. The final major thing that Borderlands 3 deserves the credit for is its DLCs. Additional content is sort of a Borderlands game's bread and butter, so to speak. Gearbox has managed time and time again to release an amazing lineup of DLCs for each of their games. So much so that twice now we've gotten a DLC that ended up being so large and in-depth that it got turned into a full game. Borderlands 3 is absolutely no different in that regard. Every single DLC for Borderlands 3 is an absolute banger. Guns, Love, and Tentacles is an amazing take on Lovecraftian horror in a Borderlands game. Bounty of Blood is a spectacular Borderlands adaptation of a Western, even if I don't personally like the genre. Ava's Murder Mysteries did a great job of cliffhangering us for the follow-up game, and actually somewhat redeemed Ava's character. And Psycho Krieg and his fantastic Fustercluck was insanely cool for giving us more information into one of the game's most mysterious characters, even if its side content left a bit to be desired. Even the Handsome Jackpot DLC, despite being my least favorite of the main four, is super fun, engaging, and has some great loot to farm, and despite me personally not liking Arms Race, I can understand why somebody who likes a bare-bone shooter would love to play it. The DLC drops for this game were absolutely phenomenal. Gearbox just straight up did not miss in terms of DLC content for this game, and it by far, in my opinion, has the best DLC lineup of any of the other titles. Now, the DLCs did have their own share of issues with all the power creep and whatnot, but the actual DLCs themselves are hands down the best in the series. Another pretty small but significant thing that Borderlands 3 got right was making True Voltner mode completely optional. In Borderlands 3, normal mode with Mayhem on is the exact same as True Voltner mode with Mayhem on. Same elemental damage bonuses, same enemy changes, and so on. This means that people who don't like doing multiple story playthroughs don't have to get to max level or farm up the gear they want, and they can instead spend that time simply grinding their character up. Now, I can't quite give full points for this as it's not explicitly stated anywhere in the game that True Voltner mode is completely optional, and I still regularly see people who think there's a real difference. But the fact of the matter still stands that True Voltner mode is completely optional in Borderlands 3, which was an amazing change for players who don't like multiple playthroughs. The first major fail in Borderlands 3 that I want to talk about is its UI. At first glance, the user interface seems leaps and bounds ahead of its predecessor with a new look and new features. However, after playing for more than an hour or two, it is very apparent that many of the same issues from the past games still persist in this game, and even more new ones are popping up. I still, to this day, have about a 50-50 shot of something I highlight on the map actually giving me the information it should. My inventory never seems to know if I'm clicking an item or dragging an item, and my Guardian rank perk menu just straight up doesn't function at all if I'm using my mouse to look at them. If a skill description goes for longer than the default text box allows, there's no way to scroll down on PC. Sometimes I'll go to buy items from a vendor and see my currently equipped items instead. Oh, and sometimes just seeing an item of the day in certain vendors will completely explode my game, forcing me to relaunch the game in the middle of a mission or the Malawan takedown. While I appreciate Gearbox taking the time to attempt to modernize their user interface, they probably should have worked on fixing the one they had before attempting to make an entirely new one with a whole new set of bugs. In my Borderlands 2 The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I talked about how iconic the maps in that game were. How memorable maps like the Caustic Caverns, Thousand Cuts, Bloodshot Stronghold, Flamerock Refuge, Lynchwood, and Opportunity were. That is straight up just not something I get with Borderlands 3. The only map in this game that feels even slightly iconic is Jacob's Estate. So many different maps in this game feel super dull, bland, and just completely forgettable. Keep in mind that I am only referring to the base game maps. The DLC maps were absolutely amazing. While I do understand what Gearbox was trying to do with the multiple different planets, in the end it sort of just feels like an excuse for them to reuse the same color palette over and over again. Every map on Pandora just looks boring and dull, and even the Cathedral of the Twin Gods, despite being meant to be a huge climaxing moment in the story, just does nothing for me. Most of the maps in the main game feel incredibly repetitive and just don't bring anywhere close to the same amount of wow factor as other maps in the franchise do. Hell, 95% of Pandora is just desert. And while to some extent that's kind of the point, Lynchwood was also a desert, and it is far more memorable than any map in Borderlands 3. The maps in Borderlands 3's base game were a huge letdown for me personally, even if the DLC maps were pretty damn awesome. Well, we couldn't possibly get through a Borderlands 3 video review without talking about world drops, so here it goes. I always found the world drop rate situation in Borderlands 3 to be rather funny, because on one hand it makes sense, but then on the other hand it really doesn't. Like, I really don't feel that taking on the easy map of Athenas is deserving of 10 legendaries at Mayhem 10 or 11. But then on the other hand, if I kill the most tanky boss in the game and get a bunch of greens and blues, you're goddamn right I'd be pretty pissed off. The world drop rates in Borderlands 3 for me are very 50-50. For bosses and raid bosses, I personally think they're fine where they are. But for random mob enemies who die in a half a second because I gave them a mean look, the world drop rates are far too high. As is the case with so many different things in this franchise, I feel like the perfect spot would be a middle ground between Borderlands 2 and Borderlands 3. Because world drops are for sure too common in Borderlands 3, but then in Borderlands 2 they're way too rare. While world drop rates for bosses in Borderlands 3 are fine for me, I think the world drop rate should have been toned down just a little bit more for basic enemies. Speaking of drops and unique weapons, I think it's about time we talk about the unique blues and purples in this game, because holy crap, they are bad. The sheer amount of god-awful blue and purple uniques in Borderlands 3 is absolutely insane. There are 73 different unique non-legendary weapons across the game in all its DLCs, and yet the only ones that actually stand out to me as slightly viable are the ones that are borderline overpowered, like the Crit, the Hail, and the Dakota. I'm sure if you've watched my Borderlands 2 The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly video from the end of last month, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, wait a minute, didn't you complain that unique blues and purples were too strong in that game? And yeah, you're right, I did. But it seems Gearbox way overcorrected when it comes to Borderlands 3's uniques because by god, they are for the most part essentially just vendor fodder. Once again, this is an area where a middle ground would have been perfect for the game. Unique blues and purples shouldn't be the strongest weapons in the game, but they also shouldn't be the most useless either. Another huge miss for Borderlands 3 is the lack of a pearlescent rarity in this game. Hunting for pearlescent weapons in Borderlands 1 and 2 is so much fun, and it feels so damn good to get one to drop after grinding out an enemy for so long. Yet in Borderlands 3, Gearbox decided that pearlescent weapons could not make a comeback for this entry due to limitations of the last generation of consoles. I think having pearls make a comeback could have actually made quite a difference in the feeling of constant orange vomit that the enemies do in this title. As if there was something rarer than legendary that we actually had to try to get, it could have given us something more rewarding to farm for. The funniest part to me is that there are weapons in this game that could have been clear pearlescent weapons due to just how crazy strong they are. Weapons like the Reflux, Backburner, Plague Bearer, Complex Root, Anarchy, and the Plasma Coil. Yet all of these weapons, and even past pearlescents from Borderlands 2, are just legendary. The same rarity as weapons like the 9V or the Warlord. A lot of people were really hoping for pearls to make some form of comeback for Borderlands 3, but unfortunately for us, they never did. Power creep is a huge issue in Borderlands 3, and I've talked about it many times before. There are just so many weapons that are essentially stronger versions of already existing weapons, like the Reflux, the Plague Bearer, the Free Radical, the Beacon, the Monarch, the Tidal Wave, the Redistributor, and the Kick Charger. That essentially leaves a bunch of other weapons being literal relics of the past, with no uses beyond bloating loot pools. There's also a whackload of skills that borderline carry entire builds like Fire in the Skagdan, Short Fuse, and Violent Momentum. And while Short Fuse should be relatively powerful, being a capstone and all that, Fire in the Skagdan and Violent Momentum are tier 1 skills that absolutely skyrocket their respective characters' damage by insane amounts. Thankfully, for the most part, these power crept skills aren't the only option, and every character's skill tree is relatively strong without them. However, it still absolutely boggles my mind how Moe's become stronger simply by turning the difficulty slider up to Mayhem 10 or 11. Power creep is a very real thing in games, and is usually pretty unavoidable, but Borderlands 3 is basically power creep central, and it sucks to see sometimes. Story immersion is a pretty huge part of keeping players playing your game. The more immersed a player is in the story, the more likely they are to not want to put it down. And while Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel didn't do amazing jobs of this, Borderlands 3 did by far a way worse job. The way Borderlands 3 is set up and written, your character could be entirely removed from the game and the story, and nothing would change. You are essentially playing a pawn in this game, and while the endgame and DLCs are spectacular, the main base game story basically neglects your entire existence throughout the entire game. Your character doesn't exist for any of the most integral parts of the game's story. The most common example I've seen of this is during Maya's death cutscene. However, my personal theory for that is the events of the cutscene happen while we're inside the vault, so we don't know what's going on. However, things like Tannis getting straight up kidnapped while we just sit there and stare, Tyreen draining Lilith's powers while our unstoppable force of chaos and mayhem is being stopped by a thin metal door, making no attempt to even move towards our commander, make no sense. Typhon's death is another great example of this. Tyreen comes down to stop Pandora's closure, and instead of taking this time to actually attempt to stop her, we all just stand there and stare while she has a somber conversation with her father, despite once again, the strongest force in the known universe being within arm's reach of her. There are so many examples of our character simply just not doing anything for the advancement of the plot, and it makes it incredibly difficult to actually become invested in the story when you play through it. Luckily, this is something that is completely skippable after the first time now, bringing you straight to the best part of the game, the end game, but it's still a huge gripe I have with the overall pacing and storytelling of the main game. Starting off the ugly, we have Anointments. I have been long outspoken about the insanity that is Anointments in this game, and I have an entire video going into detail about all the reasons I absolutely hate the system. For starters, there are simply just far too many of them, making getting any specific one way rarer than it has to be. And even with the addition of the reroll machine, getting the right anointment can take multiple hours and tens of thousands of iridium. I'm lucky enough to be playing on PC and use mods to cut the cost by 225 iridium, but for people who aren't comfortable modding their game, or playing on a console, there's essentially no recourse for anoint farming. Another thing I really don't like about anointments is that they really undercut the class system in a way. Amara is supposed to be the elemental powerhouse of the game, and yet with anointments, every single character can have an additional 3 elements added onto their weapons. Moe's is supposed to be the infinite ammo character, yet Zane's clone anointment gives him stronger ammo regeneration than Moe's could ever dream of. Those are just a few examples, but there are many others. What I find particularly irritating about anointments is that Borderlands had already perfected an anointment style mechanic with Luneshines in the pre-sequel. The bonuses weren't game-changing while still being nice to have, and there were only a few of them, none of which felt way too overpowered. Just like a lot of things in Borderlands 3, Gearbox took a system that was perfectly adequate and turned it up to 100, which ended up being just way too much in my opinion. Another area that Borderlands 3 way overdid it in is its class mods. Up until this point in the franchise, class mods have been a really simple increase to a set group of stats, with skill boosts that were in line with those stat bonuses. In Borderlands 3, that entire system got thrown out the window. Now, class mods are essentially an entire capstone skill that provide anything from a very useless sentinel cooldown to game-breaking abilities. This is more so just a personal preference, but I much prefer the class mods from the previous games. Another pretty massive issue I have with the class mods and artifacts in Borderlands 3 is the randomized passives. The class mods in Borderlands 3 no longer have a set group of passives they can roll with, but rather they all have 69 different passives they can roll with. Legendaries roll with any 3 of the 69 passives in addition to their primary ability. The major problem I have with this is the fact that 75% of these passives are either damn near useless or so completely niche and specific that they may as well be useless. It also makes farming for any specific passive an absolute nightmare, and while rare drops are cool in Borderlands games, that's what makes the Cobra so much fun to farm for, having such an essential piece of gear be so damn rare is absolutely insane to me. At least half of the class mod passives in this game could be removed from the loot pool, and I bet 90% of people wouldn't notice, and even more wouldn't care. This is by far my biggest issue with Borderlands 3, and I really hope that they at the very least dial back the sheer number of passives that are available for Borderlands 4. Speaking of things being a pain in the ass to farm for, loot pool bloating has been an issue since the beginning of Borderlands 3's life cycle, and while it has gotten better, it is still a pretty major issue even today. So many enemies in the base game have multiple drops in their dedicated pool. Most enemies have at least 2, with several having 3, and some even having 4 or 5 separate dedicated drops in their pool. That means that even with the 30% chance to drop a dedicated item, getting the correct dedicated drop from a source is a massive pain in the ass most of the time. This issue is mostly caused by just how many different legendary items there are in this game, with almost 300 different unique items in need of a drop source, and much less than 300 different drop sources in the game. Which is really annoying, especially considering a lot of those weapons feel very samey or underwhelming. The loot pool bloat in Borderlands 3 is a huge issue for me, and really makes farming for anything specific an absolute slog in the base game.